All right. My name is Sarah Marks. I am a librarian here at Falvey, and I work with the political science department as well as public administration and psychology and brain sciences. Before we get into it, there is pizza in the back. So you should feel free to get pizza if you want to eat while you're listening. That is totally fine. It'll just be back there. So feel free to get up and help yourself. Thank you so much for joining us today. The campus and the world have been a little saturated with post-election discourse analysis, et cetera. So I'm personally very honored that you all decided to come for this panel today, which I'm also personally very happy to hear. So first, I'd like to thank our event co-sponsors, the Center for Peace and Justice Education, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Communication, and Let's Vote Nova. So today we are so honored to have this panel of 3 Villanova faculty experts who regularly come and share their insights around this time of year. And they're here to discuss various aspects of our presidential election that we just had. I'm going to introduce all 3 speakers now, and then I will turn it over to them. So first, we're going to have Dr. Billie Murray, who is an associate professor of rhetoric, Assistant Director for Academics in the Center for Peace and Justice Education. She completed her doctorate in Communication Studies at UNC at Chapel Hill, earned her BA summa cum laude in Communication Studies and Political Science from the College of Charleston, and her MA in Communication from UNC at Greensboro. Today, Dr. Murray will speak on the role of social movements and protests and their effect on the 2024 election. We will then hear from Dr. Matt Kerbel, who is a professor emeritus in the Department of Political Science. He served as a professor since 1988 and was chair of the department from 2012 to 2019. He also served as an interim associate vice provost for teaching and learning. He received his BA in English literature at the State University of New York at Binghamton. His MA and PhD were from the University of Michigan. He is the author and editor of 9 books and numerous articles and book chapters on political communication, campaigns and elections, and the presidency. And today, Dr. Kerbel is going to discuss constants and change in the election post-Biden. We will then hear from Dr. Camille Burge-Hicks, chair and associate professor in political science. Dr. Burge-Hicks received her Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Bethune-Cookman University and a master's and PhD in political science from Vanderbilt University. Camille's research interests lie at the intersections of political psychology, racial and ethnic politics, and U.S. public opinion and political behavior. Her talk today will focus on group identities, emotions, and misinformation, a lethal combination in politics. And we'll discuss how misinformation becomes a potent force in politics when connected to emotions and group identities. So now, at this time, I will invite our first panelist, Dr. Billie Murray, to begin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for that introduction, and thank you, as always, to Callie Stahl and Gina Duffy and Sean, who's taking pictures in the back, for all your work organizing these panels. They're always so great, and your work is so appreciated. I'm honored to be here with my brilliant colleagues from political science, Dr. Burge-Hicks and Dr. Kerbel, and I hope we can provide some good fodder for you guys today for some discussion. So, as some of you might know, this panel was originally slated for before the election, and so any preparations or ideas that I had for this panel kind of got scrapped after November 5th, so, and then like I think some folks, I sort of just wallowed in despair for a while about the state of our democracy and avoided thinking about this panel altogether. When I finally sort of had to force myself to return to it, honestly, I was simply at a loss. What can I possibly say in this moment about the role of social movement and protest in this election? I could focus on my research on the movements of the far right and how those movements have had effects, not just on this election, but on our entire democracy. But ultimately, I just couldn't bring myself to rehash all of that again. Not yet, anyway. I'm sure that time will come. So then I was in a panic. To talk about today. And so I decided to go digging in some old field notes, looking for something, some pithy quote, some story, some inspiration to motivate me, something, anything to push me forward. And I did find some things and some what I'm calling parables from the democratic places where I spend most of my research time. What I rediscovered from reading these notes was that the amazing activists that I had worked with over the past 20 years of doing this kind of research was their unwavering belief in democracy, in the democratic practices, like protests, that are meaningful, impactful, and far more motivating than any presidential election. And so I want to share these with you today, these parables from democratic places, with the hope that they can provide all of you with some small amount of optimism for the road ahead. And so I'll start with a parable from my very first major fieldwork project in 2007 with an anti-torture activists in North Carolina. These activists were old school. These were Catholics and Quakers and hippies from the 1960s. Some had marched with King, some had allied with Malcolm, some had served prison time for burning draft cards, and y'all know which group it was that did that. These Catholics. All of them were working together to end extraordinary rendition and torture that was instituted by the Bush administration during the war on Iraq. But me, I was an idealistic little grad student, a grad student who was really excited about her fieldwork with these amazing folks, but who would also not shut up about the then presidential hopeful Barack Obama. I could not stop talking about how energized I was to possibly be a part of this historic moment, how fun campaigning for him door to door felt, getting out the vote, telling anyone who would listen that my son, who was not quite 2 at the time, kept calling him Boo Mama, which is my favorite thing. But my activist friends, they just sort of smiled and nodded at me. They just didn't seem very excited, and I was confused, incredulous, really. Why aren't you excited? Why aren't you out there campaigning? Why isn't your car covered with Obama-Biden bumper stickers? And that's when one of them sat me down, and she said, we're excited. We're excited to vote for the first Black president of the United States. But we also know from all of our years of activism and struggles for justice that politicians don't make change. We do. Change comes from us here on the ground, fighting the good fight and working however we can to make our world more just and peaceful. And I was stunned into silence, which is a rarity, but more than that, I was stunned into contemplation. And I think that's where some of you, students, first-time campaigners, first-time voters, maybe that's where you are right now. You all worked so hard. We all worked so hard. You got out the vote. You did all the things. And now you're likely stunned, maybe scared, maybe angry, or maybe just despondent. But it's my hope that we can all learn or relearn what I have from these activists. That real change comes from us, not just in the voting booth and the call center, but in the everyday, in the way we live democracy in our local communities. The way I have already seen so many of us, people in this room, time and again, approach the world with an ethic of care and an ethic of justice. I know it can be hard to marshal strength right now, but I know we will. I know that one day, my students and other young people, they'll be the old school activists telling a new generation that things are better and more peaceful and more just than they once were when they were young. And that change happened because we learned and understood that change comes from us, from all of us together, working and creating that world. But how? That's the question, right? What is it that we can do beyond voting, beyond the electoral politics that have too often been a source of discouragement? American political scientist Frances Fox Piven argues that electoral politics are dominated by elite interests and inevitably lead to pro-elite policies. So she argues that things like strikes, boycotts, occupations, and civil disobedience are all examples of disruptive power in action. Those are her suggestions for how to do democracy, and maybe sometimes my suggestions too. I see my students. But of course, there are so many others. We just need to enact them. Kenneth Burke once said that the test of a revolutionary position is not in what one rejects, but in what one would put in place of the rejected. And so I moved to my second parable, moving from the criticism and critique of the rejected to the democratic practices that we would put into place of the rejected. This parable comes from a couple years later, in 2009, when I attended a doctoral honors seminar on communication activism in Detroit. When I first arrived in Detroit, I was saddened by what I saw. Hundreds of abandoned buildings and neighborhoods, crumbling factories, many unhoused people, hundreds of empty lots where homes had once stood. I had seen poverty and devastation before in the rural areas of the South where I'm from, but at that time I had never been to an urban area quite like this. An area that was now just a skeleton of an obviously once thriving body of industry and wealth and progress. And I shed real tears for that place and the people I saw enduring it. But then I met a longtime resident of Detroit, a woman who had a way of using words to inspire, to challenge, to encourage, and to create a vision of the Detroit she wanted to see. Grace Lee Boggs was, at the time, a 92-year-old Asian American philosopher, scholar, and activist who was educated right down the street at Bryn Mawr. And she was a huge part of the Black Power movement, the labor movement, and countless other grassroots movements in Detroit. She had lived there for over 50 years. And as I talked and worked with her over 4 far too short days, she taught me many things that I have never forgotten. She said that, quote, positive changes, leaps forward in the evolution of humankind do not start with governments. When asked to comment on the then successful election of President Obama, she echoed my anti-war friends. She said, we can't wait around for presidents or leaders to swoop in and fix our problems. We are the leaders we are looking for. And then she introduced me to some of these leaders in the local community around her home. She introduced me to Mike, who was a hilarious storyteller and a licensed contractor, who showed me his block of Detroit, his democratic place, where he was helping his community rebuild. First, the community had taken over an abandoned park and built a place for peace, where folks could gather to work out their differences without violence, and where they had placed stones to symbolically bury classism, racism, sexism, and hate. They created community gardens tended by unhoused people who were able and offered food to anyone who needed it for free. They made a place to offer digital technology and graphic arts training to community members. They built a place for benches and signs where people would write down their troubles and their fears and their problems and wait for other community members to later sit on that same bench and write down suggestions and possible solutions. A place where Mike said he was working just one small block at a time to rebuild and reclaim the spaces of his community that had been abandoned by the city planners and the state and federal governments. Mike was the leader he was looking for. He wasn't waiting for a government official or a presidential candidate to save his community. Instead, he was joining his community and working to save it, despite the statistics and the hopelessness that must, at times, have seemed really overwhelming, maybe as some of us feel right now. They were the leaders, and they built the democratic place they were looking for. I learned then that democracy lives in the local, in the everyday. It lives in the public parks and the idea benches and the places for peace. It lives in the democratic places that we must build and rebuild with our communities. This is our challenge, and I know we can meet it. Sociologist Sidney Tarrow has argued that we are in a permanent movement society where individual movements might wax and wane over time, but the contentious politics that social movements and social protests create are actually the way that politics should work. In other words, it's up to us to create democratic places and to move the social. And not only by voting in better presidents, though that absolutely, of course, matters. And so the question isn't really for me anymore, how can social movements affect presidents? But how can we affect social change? How can we move the social beyond the confines of electoral politics? How can we become the leaders that we are looking for? I think one of the first steps we can take if we want to understand how protests and social movements actually affect change in the world is to rid ourselves of the notion that the purpose of a protest is simply to persuade, particularly that it's supposed to persuade elite politicians. Now, sometimes protest works to raise awareness and persuade certain members of the public. Sometimes protest works to persuade members of a movement to keep struggling and stay involved. But very rarely in my experience are protests engaged to persuade those in power, like presidents, to share or give up their power. Protests instead often have different goals and different effects. They move beyond simple persuasion. Protests and social movements in a larger sense work to create new ways of being in the world. They work to expand the world of thinkable thoughts Thoughts like the abolition of slavery, the 40-hour work week, women or people of color voting, marriage equality, to even think about most of these ideas was for some to go against their country, their laws, their families, even their religion. These were quite simply unthinkable thoughts before social movements, before groups of everyday people working together in solidarity brought them into our reality. More recently, conversations about defunding the police, abolishing prisons, universal health care, these have all become topics of conversation all over the country and a reality in some places. These are things that most people have never considered a thinkable thought, much less an actionable policy. And so social movements and the protests they engage can have policy effects. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the 19th, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Kerbel versus Hodges. And I'm not suggesting that these laws and high-level policies aren't important. They absolutely are. They affect a lot of people. But social movements are where these policies often start. And more importantly, social movements have rhetorical and cultural effects far beyond the world of policy. These effects are hard to measure, as my colleagues, I'm sure, will say. Though we do know that these things happen. These kinds of changes can be seen in how our language, our everyday practices, our imagery, and our culture changes over time. Think about how it was once unthinkable to organize your society without a king. Or more recently, how we do and do not talk about disability, about mental health, how we have positive and humanized representations of trans people and other minoritized people in popular culture, how terms like the 99%, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too have created new ways for us to understand and live in our world. They are now unavoidable topics of conversation in the public sphere. And what rhetorical scholars like myself want you to see is that that is no small thing. When we change the way we talk about something, we change the way we think about something. We give new meaning to our reality. And that is social movement. It is the movement of public consciousness, of how we understand the world, how the social is moved forward. That movement doesn't come from nowhere. It is not inevitable. It happens through the work of everyday people, not just presidents or Congress or courts. This is the work of social movements and the rhetorics they engage. This is the work that challenges and changes injustice. So get out there and talk about the world that you want for yourself, for your family, your community, your country. Live the reality that you want to see every day and communicate that reality into existence. It is one of the most important, impactful, and democratic things that you can do. This leads me to my final parable from a democratic place, one that I have visited often in my research, where hate groups are confronted by communities of people standing up and saying, no, not here, not in my community. This parable comes from a hate speech rally and counter-protest I attended in 2015 after the murders of the Emanuel 9 in South Carolina. Early in the day, before the rally had even really started, I saw an older man wearing a large sandwich board type sign with a red target painted on it, and it said, "Unarmed black man, don't miss." I was absolutely terrified for him. He was walking around alone, and there were already some Klan and neo-Nazis walking around the South Carolina State House, not to mention very heavily armed police officers. And I couldn't bear to see him walking alone like that, a target. So I stood with him for a while and I told him how scared I was for his safety. He put his hand on my shoulder and he looked me straight in the eyes and he said with so much sincerity, "I have to do what I have to do. We all have to do what we have to do." And in that moment, after so many years of learning from anti-war activists, from Grace, from Mike, I understood. We must learn or relearn what it means to participate in our democracy, about what it truly means to put your body on the line for social justice. I understood, maybe for the first time, that we all have to do what we have to do. And so I will close by saying that I hope that these 3 little short parables from democratic places are helpful to you, as they have been to me over the years, and particularly in this moment. Things are hard, and if history is any indication, things will get harder. But we can do hard things. We can live out the promises of democracy in the everyday, in the local, and we can all do what we have to do. We can be the leaders that we are looking for.
pass it along. I forgot to say up at the beginning that we'll have time for questions at the end. So we'll let all three speak, and then we'll take your questions. So I'll pass it now on to Dr. Kerbel. Thank you.
I don't know how to follow that. I don't even want to follow that because I just really thank you. What Dr. Murray just told you, I think if you take nothing else away from this session, I really believe he's hit the most important points. What I had planned to do also before the election was to talk a little bit about how there was a great deal of continuity in the underlying dynamics of the contest pre and post Biden. I don't know that that's the most important thing to talk about anymore. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, modify my remarks a bit and see if we can address a couple of other questions that might be more pertinent to where we are now. Specifically, why is it that every election for the past 8 years has been the most important election of our lives? Why is that? Why is it that when all of the metrics of campaigning, which is to say the way a candidate manages a campaign, the way a campaign operates organizationally, why did all of those metrics, really all of them, point to a Harris victory, but that's not what happened? And finally, what did happen? How do we interpret the results of the election? I hope that those are going to be more useful questions to delve into. So let's see if we can take each of those one at a time. 45, 50 years ago, America was more than 90% white. In somewhere between 15 and 20 years from now, sounds like a long time, but really in the scope of history, not very long, America will be a majority-minority nation, which is to say that whites will make up less than 50% of the population. This is a long-term, slow-moving, generational shift. And it's profound because it's unlike any other generational shift in our history. We are living at a moment when if we think of this shift in terms of generations, generations growing in numbers and rising, and generations that are receding, Millennials and Gen Z together represent the rising generations in this country. And Gen X, baby boomers, older folks, are, as demographers like to put it, exiting the electorate. We'll just use that euphemism. We are living through a moment right now when the rising electorate is on the cusp of equaling and potentially exceeding in numbers the receding electorate. And when that happens, it means that the rising electorate is poised to claim political power. As this became evident, and as the differences between the two groups became pronounced, which is to say, not just simply in terms of the fact that this country will become a multicultural country in a way that it never was. We're also looking at tremendous attitudinal differences. Attitudes, younger generations collectively, and again, I'm speaking in the aggregate, so I'm not speaking to any individual, but in the aggregate, younger generations are hold different values, hold different attitudes than older generations' attitudes towards just about everything. Institutions, government action, religion, you name it. What this means is anybody who's invested in the status quo, anyone who's invested in the power dynamics of the status quo, might resist the changes that are happening. And over the past 8 years, that resistance has come to manifest itself in a reaction. And that reaction is the group we call MAGA. MAGA is not, sometimes this is a misnomer that I take issue with reporters for doing this. MAGA is not a conservative movement in the traditional sense. It is a reactionary movement. It stands in opposition to the changes taking place in society, and it says make them stop. Or, at the more extreme end, roll back the clock. Roll back the clock to an earlier time, maybe an imagined earlier time, maybe an earlier time that never even existed. but an earlier time which will preserve those traditional power structures, attitudes, values, those dynamics. As this happened, something shifted in American public opinion. And it's important, it's meaningful, because historically, American public opinion has been what we would consider to be centrist. That most Americans, or more Americans than not, would consider themselves some kind of version of a moderate or a centrist. Maybe they lean a little bit to the right, maybe they lean a little bit to the left. But by and large, you had this really, fairly significant unimodal distribution of public opinion in the United States, centered in the middle. And we layer on top of that two political parties trying to win elections. So when parties want to win elections, what do? They look for where the voters are. We also have a winner-take-all political system, which means you win the election and you win the right to govern the country. You win all the representation. It's not a power share. When public opinion is unimodally distributed, that's not necessarily a problem, because there'll be a winner, there'll be a loser, but the winner understands there's going to be another election. And they need to make sure that in order to win that election, they keep going where the voters are. So the voters are going to be right next to them under the umbrella of that other political party. There are always going to be those voters who are willing to maybe alternate between the two. That tends to facilitate compromise, and it tends to facilitate moderation. But what's happening in our politics with the rise of this reactionary movement, this reactionary moment that we're in, is public opinion has become bimodally distributed. We now live on one of two public opinion islands. One of those islands in the last election was represented by Donald Trump, and the other island in the last election was represented by Kamala Harris. But we still have winner-take-all elections, which means this was an election to see which island got to govern both islands. And that was the case in the last election in 2020. It was the case in the election before that, in 2016. It was even, to a somewhat less extent, but no less important, in play during the midterm elections between those presidential elections. That's the moment we're living in. So it's against this backdrop that this campaign took place. And something really unprecedented, as we know, happened during this campaign. We started out, and it was going to be a replay of 2020. There's a reason why it was going to be a replay of 2020. Because if we step back for a second and look at the changes taking place in the country, and we look at where the emerging electorate is relative to the receding electorate, the Democratic Party in 2020 made a decision, a calculation really, a strategic choice. They said, a lot of people competing for Democratic nomination. It was the largest and most diverse field we've ever seen compete for a nomination. But Democratic voters, and this started in South Carolina where the vote was largely black Democrats, decided that in 2020, the country really wasn't quite ready. Yes, we had elected Barack Obama, but maybe it wasn't the wisest strategic choice to ask the country to vote for a person of color or a woman at a time when Donald Trump was making noises about not leaving the White House even if he lost. So the Democratic Party decided to go with an old, white, male, devout Catholic from the 20th century. And he, in turn, offered himself as a bridge between the politics of the 20th century, where he came of age, and whatever may happen next. Fast forward to 2024, and the electorate is still not quite there. But it's also clear that the Republican Party is going to nominate Donald Trump again. Because for other reasons that I won't go into now, Donald Trump staged a successful takeover of the Republican Party. So there was no doubt he was going to be the Republican nominee. So Biden said, I'm going to do it again. doesn't matter how old I am, I'm going to do it again because I'm the only person who has proven that I can defeat Donald Trump. And that set up a rematch. Now, Biden was not challenged in the primaries. He was not challenged. And that was because largely Democratic voters, and maybe more importantly, Democratic elites, decided that the best avenue forward was with Joe Biden. But we know what happened. If you saw that debate in July, you understand how people responded to that within the Democratic Party. And what happened was Democratic elites started to abandon Joe Biden. And Democratic donors started to abandon Joe Biden. When you start running out of money, your campaign ends. And that's basically what happened. It took a period of about 3 weeks for Biden either to decide or, having been not so gently pushed, whatever it may have been, he exited. And he passed the baton to his vice president, to Kamala Harris. At the time, I wrote that we now have, to the extent that this election is about preserving and protecting democracy, we now have to make a choice that will be a very stark choice between the future and the past. Because if Biden was the bridge between those two, when he left the race, the bridge collapsed. And it was left to Kamala Harris to, from the Democrats' perspective, get the country to the other side, and to do it now, not 4 years from now. So, objectively, and there'll be postmortems written about this, anytime you have a losing campaign, people point fingers. I will say right now that if you simply look at the way the campaign conducted itself, the way Harris conducted herself as a candidate, and when you look at what she was asked to do with 100 days left, to redefine this campaign, introduce herself to the country, choose a running mate, raise money, put together an organization that would have to be different than the organization designed to elect Biden, change the messaging, hold a convention, have a debate, prepare for it, do it, all of that. If you look at every single metric, if you look at dollars raised, if you look at original donors, first-time donors, if you look at small donors, if you look at individual groups that arose to support her candidacy, if you look at her performance in the debate, if you just anything you look at, she did everything that was asked of her. And if we were looking at this as a traditional, typical campaign through the lens of what does a winning campaign look like, it looked like the Harris campaign. And for that matter, Donald Trump appeared to be on fumes in the last 2 weeks of the election. He was canceling events. He was sort of fritzing out in public. He was here in Oaks, Pennsylvania, and for about 40 minutes he listened to his playlist in front of, it's just things that are not typically associated with winning campaigns. But when the votes were counted, that's not the way it played out. So, what happened? One way of looking at what happened is this election was decided on different terms than 2020, and it was decided on different terms in the 2022 midterms, and for that matter, every other election since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade. Because in every election since Dobbs, Democrats have performed very well. And there appeared to be an anti-MAGA majority that had shown up in all these other elections. So if you put those two things together and you look at the way Harris acquitted herself and you look at the campaign, it pointed towards the possibility that that would replicate itself, that would repeat itself again, and it did not. So what are the explanations? Well, I'm going to leave to Dr. Burge one of the explanations that deals with gender and race, which is a factor here. But let me talk about another factor that may describe what happened. When people vote on issues, it's different than when they vote on candidates. And across the country earlier this month, people in red states voted for progressive positions. They voted to enshrine abortion rights in their constitutions. They voted to raise the minimum wage in places like Missouri. They voted on pro-union legislation across the country. But a lot of these same voters turned around and voted for Donald Trump, who doesn't stand for any of these things or might work to undermine them. which means that they were voting for different reasons. One way of looking at the coalition that Trump put together is to look first to the MAGA base, which is always there, but it's never been enough to win a plurality or a majority, and I think in the end it's going to be shy of a majority. It looks like Trump is headed for a plurality shy of 50%. But it's never been enough. The other people who voted for him, from what we can tell early on, and this is subject to revision once we have good exit poll data, which is going to take a couple of months. But what appears to be the case is you have another group of voters that voted for change, that voted against the incumbent because they wanted to go in a different direction. A lot of these voters, I think we're going to find, were motivated by economic factors, motivated by inflation. Why do I say that? Because we've seen that phenomenon happen around the world. This is the first time since, I believe we can go back to 1908, where every democracy held an election this year. Every democracy that held an election this year, the incumbent party lost vote share. Doesn't matter if the incumbent party was a party of the left, party of the center, or a party of the right. For those who were watching the British elections, that was a party of the right, and they were wiped out. It happened here as well. It's the first time that's happened. So I think you can make the case that this was the second COVID election. That the first COVID election helped sweep Joe Biden into power. It was an anti-incumbent election during a period of great personal dislocation. And the second COVID election was this month. People blame the incumbent party for inflation, for higher prices, and wanted to make a change. We know by looking at some of the data prior to the election that there is still a majority in this country that considers Donald Trump to be a threat to democracy, to be dangerous. That number is probably close to 53 or 54%. It suggested that Trump's ceiling was 46, 47. And that's what it looked like it might be going into the election. That's what I thought it was going to be. And if people had made their decisions based on that, based on their perceptions of Trump, if this had been a referendum on Donald Trump, the outcome might well have been different. But it apparently was not. If it was a referendum on incumbency, if it was a referendum on change, if voters who might not like Donald Trump but were drawn to the fact that he is a chaos agent and that he wants to break things up, then you could understand they would vote for him. It's usually the case that the candidate who is better liked wins. That was Kamala Harris. It's usually the case that the candidate who scores better on the measure of do you understand the concerns of people usually win. That was Kamala Harris. She didn't win. So those issues clearly were not paramount in the decision-making of enough voters. And that helped Donald Trump. So let me wrap up very quickly. I promised to say, okay, well, now what? This was not a sweeping victory. It was a national victory, but it was not anything close to a landslide. The margin will be about 1.5 points, give or take. In the swing states that mattered, 2 points or less. In terms of the national popular vote margin, much smaller than Biden's margin 4 years before that. But that will only matter if, A, Donald Trump interprets it as a mandate, which he already is, and B, if people don't like what ends up happening, that they engage in the kind of collective action, the kind of social action that is not only necessary, but the only thing that can make a difference in an environment like this. So, from the standpoint of democracy, the country is in a precarious place, but it's not in a hopeless place. It's in a place where we all need to open our eyes. We need to be on guard. We need to be watchful. And for those of us who feel compelled to do something, even something small, a lot of very small actions can add up to a lot.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I just first want to thank Falvey Library. I was looking back through my emails. I've been invited to give this talk since 2016. I've been here for 10 years. Billie Murray and I have done this is our third presidential election talk, so thank you all for always inviting us to provide our perspectives. And I apologize in advance for being a dark cloud to Billie's very optimistic speech as well as Matt's. But today I'm going to talk about group identities, emotions, and misinformation. What I believe is one of the most pressing issues in American politics and a lethal combination in our politics as we move forward. So I want to take us back a little bit to August of 2022. During that time, computer hackers from around the world descended upon Las Vegas, Nevada for their annual conference known as DEF CON. Everybody knows about this. It's huge. So inspired by conspiracy theories surrounding widespread fraud in the 2020 presidential election, one session at DEF CON was devoted to taking election machines apart and actually examining whether voting results can be tampered with and or completely changed. The hackers, and these are some of the best hackers in the world, if you're familiar with DEF CON, they found that it was nearly impossible to make changes to votes once they had been cast. And so the problem with elections, and even further election integrity in America, has little to do with voting machines, and in my estimation, everything to do with misinformation. During DEF CON, Chris Krebs, the former director of the Department of Homeland Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, stated, "The biggest vulnerability in democracy is the people. It's the brain, it's the perception hack." The American Psychological Association defines misinformation as false or inaccurate information where people actually get the facts wrong. Political scientists working on misinformation in the political landscape in the early 2000s, one of my favorite pieces by Kuklinski et al., they state that a person is misinformed when he or she firmly holds the wrong information, and not just when people hold like incorrect factual beliefs, but they do so confidently. They hold these incorrect beliefs confidently. And the spread of false and inaccurate information about politics is widespread. And it's eroding our democratic systems and processes, as Matt mentioned, throughout the world, or alluded to, especially in the United States. And one of the things that I've been thinking about for a couple of years is that this perception hack stems from the ways in which political elites manipulate the emotions of members of groups and how these feelings subsequently shape perceptions of a wide range of political issues. For example, election outcomes and integrity, vaccines, critical race theory, protests, police brutality, immigration, abortion, the economy. And I think that we should care about the effect of misinformation on citizens' emotions, as a waning of social cohesion is eroding trust in these institutions that we've had for years. Misinformation historically has often been circulated among individuals on the fringes of society. But today, political elites are taking a more active role in the dissemination of conspiracy theories and false narratives. It used to just be our random cousin, aunt, uncle at the Thanksgiving table. And now all of these people have united in social media, and we're here, today. We don't need to look any further than the 2022 midterms or the 2024 presidential election to really understand this dynamic. I think one of the best examples of this across both elections is that people across the country, and especially various members of the Republican Party and candidates for office at all levels of government, they're almost evenly split between those who believe that the 2020 election was stolen via massive voter fraud and those that believe the election was won by Joe Biden. And so what is the American public to do, especially when we're getting mixed messages from political elites about these theories? How are we to engage in the political sphere? How are we supposed to feel, right, when the messages and the cues are unclear? And so the research that I do in political psychology focuses on the role of groups and emotions in public opinion and political decision making. with this idea that both groups and emotions both inform how people experience politics. Whether that's racial, religious, gender, partisan, socioeconomic, groups provide cues to people about how they should participate in politics and how they should evaluate policies, candidates, and institutions. Political scientists' understanding of emotions and how they affect political behavior is not as complete. The existing survey research that we tend to use when we're talking about emotions and politics focuses on one central question. It says, like, has Barack Obama, we'll do Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, insert a political candidate because of something they've ever said or done, ever made you feel, insert emotion. And so while this question is useful in helping us understand, like, how people think and feel about the actions of political elites and what it means for their politics, people have emotions about a wide range of things that have nothing to do with the actions of political elites. People have emotions about immigration. People have emotions about abortion that could be tied to gender. A wide range of issues that they could be having feelings about. One of the theories that help us understand how people process information in political science is motivated reasoning when it comes to understanding what people already know or choose to believe. And recent studies have found, and by recent I mean early 2000s, whatever, it continues to impact. Recent studies have found that partisanship is the primary vehicle for motivated reasoning, that people seek information that aligns with their partisan beliefs, and they reject information that does not. And so we have to think about, like, the role that partisan emotions, especially in this environment that we have, might play in the process. And so only recently have political psychology scholars begun to explore the emotions of groups, and in particular focusing on, like, partisan emotions via affective polarization, right? Like or dislike of partisans and its implications for politics. So if you identify as a Republican, how much you like or dislike your own fellow Republicans and Democrats is what's actually shaping your engagement in the political arena. The other strand of research, though, that I'm really interested in, especially for this conversation, is not just about partisanship, but it focuses on collective group emotions theories that have been espoused by psychology scholars, where people are writing about the various emotional experiences that people can have as members of all kinds of groups. So whether that's an LGBT plus identified group, racial and ethnic groups, gender and non-binary identified groups, and asking people, like, how they feel as members of these groups and what it then means for how they engage, analyzing what it then means for how they engage in the political arena. And what we know from these psychology scholars, especially those that study intergroup emotions theory, so how I feel about people that are outside of my group, is that how we choose to categorize ourselves determines our emotional reactions. So just to give you an example of some of this literature by Ray et al. In 2008, they did a survey with college students and asked college students to evaluate how they feel about Muslims as the target group. And so they changed the actual group that they were identifying with. So they said, as Americans, how do you feel about Muslims? As students, how do you feel about Muslims? Same target group. Also asking about emotions, but the self-categorization was different. And what they found in this early research is that when people, at least in this study, when students were categorized as students, they had stronger, like, more hopeful and positive feelings towards Muslims, as opposed to those same people, when being categorized as Americans, had more negative evaluations toward Muslim Americans. So thinking even about how categorization can shape how we're evaluating the same target. This is all going to come together really nicely, I promise you. So the power of misinformation, I believe, has increased because of the ways in which elites package information via some combination of group identities and emotions. It's not merely the information that's being distributed, but the idea that if you don't believe in that information as a group member, that you are somehow in violation of that group norm, which is what makes this so powerful in politics. So a few examples, I think, illustrate the misinformation and group emotions to politics link. First, crowd size at the 2016 inauguration of President Trump. Second, COVID vaccine hesitancy. And third, all of these conversations surrounding critical race theory. And in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to help me think through things in 2024. So, I'm going to ask you to do what teachers don't normally do in the classroom. Get out your cell phones. I want you to Google really quick 2016 Trump inauguration crowd size. 2016 Trump inauguration crowd size. What should come up immediately are these two pictures. And if I would have known this was going to be set up, I would have made a slide, but I didn't. I didn't have time to go back to my office and get my laptop. So the first thing that you'll notice when we're looking at these crowd size pictures, right, is that it's very clear to anybody with eyes that the 2016 crowd size for President Trump was much smaller than Barack Obama's. This is a fact. The National Park Service did the count. They reported the count. We can see the pictures with our own eyes. But in 2018, there were two political scientists, Brian Schaffner and Samantha Lukes, who wrote a paper about this in Public Opinion Quarterly, where they exposed respondents to the full pictures related to crowd size. And they found that even high education Republicans, so this is not a low education, low income issue, that even high education Republicans were likely to state that Trump and Obama had similar crowd sizes, and if anything, noted that Trump's were larger but manipulated by AI. So if we can't agree on crowd size, on something that we can all see, factually correct counts of people that were there by the Park Service, we have a problem. We have a real problem in American politics. The second thing that I think we could talk a lot about is misinformation surrounding the spread of COVID-19 and its remedies. At the beginning of the pandemic in February of 2020, many Black Americans were under the impression that they couldn't contract COVID-19. I remember this video of this police officer, walking around an urban housing development coughing. It went viral. And people that were staying in this housing development, some Black people were walking out and saying, we can't catch that, that's for white people, right? This was an entire conversation at the beginning of the pandemic. But as we all know, when data surrounding the cases, hospitalizations, and deaths emerged, many were surprised to learn that Black people were disproportionately affected by the virus. And these findings reignited the all too familiar feelings of fear and anxiety surrounding Black Americans' trust in medical institutions, in government. However, once several pro-vaccine campaigns were deployed, along with other changes to structural issues surrounding racial inequalities in receiving vaccines, so putting these distribution centers in more racially and ethnically diverse communities, allowing the scheduling of these appointments to occur both online and in person, vaccine mandates by employers, that many Black Americans were able to make plans to receive the vaccine and get the vaccine. And so thinking about this, the perception hack surrounding the virus was changed, as were Black Americans' willingness to obtain life-saving treatment and improve their trust in medical institutions. The third thing I'll talk about before we open it up, for a dialogue about the 2024 elections, is the great deal of misinformation that was disseminated about critical race theory. Right? This was a huge component of the 2022 midterms, of many of the special elections in 2021. Did we hear about CRT at all during this election cycle? No, not nearly as much as we heard about it in the midterms, not nearly as much as we heard about it in the 2021 elections. Why? Because some of that misinformation surrounding critical race theory had been corrected, right, with facts about what misinformation is. And so when we're talking about when it was used in its heyday, many politicians were playing on this fear, shame, and guilt of white Americans. And for those that are unaware, critical race theory is a legal concept which asserts that racism is embedded in the legal system and government policy as opposed to individual prejudice. And research surrounding critical race theory has been published and debated in the halls of academia since the 1970s. This is not a new concept, right? But after the murder of George Floyd, when many individuals were calling for a racial reckoning, and their ears were inclined towards understanding racial inequalities in America, there was a lot of backlash shortly following. And that backlash showed in the polling data as well. And one of the things that we know from the public opinion data is 7 out of 10 people don't even know what critical race theory is. They can't define it. Instead, many pundits, politicians, and political elites conflated critical race theory with any aspects of teaching about race, racism, or discrimination in schools. In 2022 on up through 2024, we know that 36 states have adopted or introduced laws or policies that restrict teaching about race and racism. In 2021, Republican candidate for Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin ran on an anti-CRT platform in a lot of these special elections, vowing to ban CRT from public schools, which are taught anyways. But many of his discussions surrounding fear of what our children are being taught resonated with a great deal of white voters. And we're thinking about groups and emotions and misinformation, and led to increased levels of political turnout, resulting in a victory for him as the governor of Virginia. So I want us to do a couple of minutes. Can I do 2 minutes, Sarah, Gina? Okay, we're almost done. All right, so I want us to brainstorm together. 2 minutes, pair and share, turn to your neighbors, about some group identities, emotions, and misinformation from this election cycle. I'll give you 2 minutes and then we'll talk. You'll talk.
I was going to say that's what I wrote about.
I'm a big YouTube watcher. That was on the I think
I'm not sure. I mean, there was a lot of also. There was a lot of arguments made to
dogs and cats. Actually, students.
All right, let's talk. It hasn't been 2 minutes, but I'm lonely. What do you think? Some group identities, some emotions, some misinformation in 2024. What do we think? Yeah, Mary Beth.
Biggest thing that I saw in in ads and things of that nature were on trans rights and being trans in general. The commercial I saw time and time again was that Kamala Harris and the Democrats wanted to pay for sex change operations for prisoners, people accused of violent crimes. So, big thing.
Yeah. So, what emotions with that?
Fear and
Anxiety?
Economic displacement kind of thing. And why the biggest thing I've seen, even just in the news, is what they say is she's for they, them, we're for you. Mm-hmm. So it was this idea that they're not us. Mm-hmm. So identity as well.
Good. Other thoughts? I'm here for that. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Gross misunderstanding of how tariffs work.
Yes. So thinking about economic fears. So conversations about inflation, about tariffs, about who's going to pay for what. And the misinformation being spread about that, about the state of the economy. When we look at the numbers, the economy is actually doing really good. When we're looking at how long it takes for economic policies to come into place, it's about a 3 to 4 year kind of gap. So when we're thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act that the Biden administration, passed, we'll probably see that happening, during, President Trump's, time during his tenure, again, as a second presidency, right? Actually having an effect. Similar things happening for Barack Obama and acts that were passed during his administration in terms of leading to greater unemployment that you don't end up actually seeing take effect, right, until 2013, 2014. So things of that nature. But yes, the economy, anxiety, fear, tariffs, inflation, and then also attribution of blame. Who do we blame for where the economy is, right? Are you scapegoating illegals, illegal immigrants? Are you blaming the Biden administration? Or are you blaming corporations that have been price gouging for a few years trying to recoup those COVID funds that they lost, which they've more than tripled, quadrupled. Other things, other emotions, other groups, 2024. Yeah.
The nature and intention of immigrant communities in the nation, preying on fear, on unfairness, on equality.
preying on fear, thinking about crime. I saw a lot of commercials about like crime and immigration. And as someone that watches Investigation Discovery a lot, right? There's a lot of white people that also commit murders, right? Like Murder by the Lake, Murder by My Neighbors, like whatever show, wherever Murder in the Homeland, right? Like, and yet we don't have these commercials talking about white on white violence. We're talking about crime in inner cities. We're talking about crime that illegal immigrants committed. Like in some of these cases were like 12, 14 years old. And you like look at them and I'm like, they weren't even in office. Like are there any more, recent examples? But so like thinking about, again, who we're scapegoating for these things, groups, what we're saying, what emotions are being appealed to. Other thoughts about 2024? We're here. Yeah, in the back. And I'll wrap it up because we're way over.
Maybe complicated and controversial, the end of democracy?
Sure. Yeah, threats about the end of democracy.
Is that fake news or is that real news?
Right. I mean, I think this is really, really interesting when we're thinking about, both Democrats and Republicans, and particularly for Democrats, like how this narrative was being used. Like, this is the last election to vote, right? Because if you don't turn out to vote, democracy will be no more, right? Like and so thinking about, is it fake news or real news, like you said, right? We'll see,
TBD.
I guess, right? Like, we'll see. But these are still concerns that, people have that were amplified in different ways. Again, connected to groups, connected to group identities in particular, emotions, and whatever kind of spin, we want to put on that. And so I'll conclude. Groups and emotions matter, of course, in politics. And I think that we need to pay a lot more attention to misinformation and how it's connected to groups and emotions. And we have to do the work to actually come up with the factual information to correct that misinformation so that it's not powerful anymore. But if we're not willing to do that work, things happen. No, I'm just kidding. But we need to be willing to do that work. We need to be willing to keep our eyes open and be aware of the things that are taking up our attention, about how issues are being framed, about how groups are being scapegoated, and about how we're being made to feel about different things, because I think it will have really important consequences, for years to come. We're thinking about election outcomes. So, thank you.
Thank you all so much. If you need to go, you should go.
Bye.
But could we take a few questions? Is that okay with the panel? Okay. I feel like we could just talk to you all afternoon. Let's take a few questions. Yes, please.
I have a question for everyone, but in particular, Dr. Murray, just because you talked about, don't be nervous, just because you talked about social movements. What do you think the role of student-led social movements, particularly the ones led at Villanova by the Students for Justice in Palestine, have an effect on not only the 2024 election, but also just like the world in general and what those student protests do to American society?
Can you hear me if I talk like this, or do I need the mic? We're good? Okay. I'll use teacher voice, right? I have one of those. So you're going to cry. Nothing gives me more hope and more sort of energy and motivation than students or young people really going out and doing things like that. I think that it is absolutely impactful. I think it is absolutely how, I think that if it weren't, then you wouldn't hear so many things that sound like, you're just a bunch of idealists, you don't know how the world really works, grow up, get a job. They say those things to you because they know how powerful those kind of movements can be. A lot of older folks remember what the anti-war protests of the 1960s looked like and how they brought the war home. I am not suggesting that any of you do that. Don't put me on the list. I want enough. But if the thing is, what sort of gets me about that is the ethics of, and it gets to what Ray was asking about, is this misinformation or not, about is democracy ending? And I am certainly one of the people that would be like, be afraid, because this is what I study. But if you are made to feel afraid by that, the solution that was offered to you, right? Because fear appeals are not always unethical, right? Sometimes we should be afraid of things. The ethicality of that comes when they say, okay, well, what can you do to stop that thing that you're afraid of, or challenge it or disrupt it? And the Democrats and most other people's advice was vote.
end, period. For me, there are so many other ways, and student protests are one of them that get those sort of voices out there, that get people sort of involved in the movement and give you a healthy outlet to sort of be involved in your democracy in ways that you can do all the time and not just every 4 years or every 2 years, right? And so for me, that's what's really important about that. And the last thing I'll say about that is if you look at these protests that we saw across the country on campuses about the war in Gaza, and the professors and the people who worked at those universities protecting those students, that is what solidarity looks like, and that is what is absolutely going to be the only way that any of this stuff is going to work, is we have to sort of invest in that local and in that community, I think, for any of those things to be successful. I can teach you how to do it technically and pragmatically, but it's that sort of community that really matters and that makes those things effective. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's my,
Thank you.
that's my spiel.
No, I loved it. Thank you.
So,
Other questions? Yes, please.
As a student leader on campus, how can I encourage my peers to check their implicit and explicit biases when it comes to like things that have transpired before and after the election? Due to the fact that I've come into conversations where I've had to educate people about how tariffs will change, or how I have to educate people about policies don't come in right then and there. It takes 3 to 4 years, like you said. So it's like, how do I come from a place of love and understanding, but at the same time, I don't want to say force them to educate themselves, but like encourage them to educate themselves and check their biases. Because like it was said that democracy, there's this thing that democracy is gonna die. I'm from New Orleans. Last weekend we threw a funeral service with a second line about democracy dying. So it's just like, it's how do I push, but like respectfully push, because it's bothering me.
so that's for me.
I don't know. It's for anyone.
Nobody else wants that? Oh gosh. That's the hard part, right? And sort of, I think, and I don't have like, here's the 5-point plan. I wish, believe me, if I did, I'd do it. What I sort of talk to students about is I think one thing you have to sort of think about is that these are not always information problems, right? Sometimes they are. Misinformation is solved by correct information sometimes, right? Because the problems that we tend to face are not problems of information. All of those people kind of got the memo. Racism is bad. You should not do things that are bad for democracy. Equality is good. People get those messages. They have that information. The holdup and what is sort of frustrating, I think, for people who are like, wait, why don't you see it this way, is that information does not disrupt meaning structures. There are meaning structures that are guiding some people, depending on what field you're in, they'll call them ideologies, the belief systems. Any of that stuff is the same thing, structures, systems, right, that tell you how to understand this issue. So one of the things we say in rhetoric all the time is we see what we are prepared to say, which means we have all of these sorts of beliefs about white supremacy, about sexism, about what it means to be an American, about everything that tell us, to talk about perception hacks, how to perceive the world. Those things are built on centuries of rhetoric, of all kinds of information and misinformation. The key then is to puncture that meaning structure. And that takes a lot more than information. It takes very specific sort of rhetorical techniques. Sometimes it's an interpersonal thing, like let me tell you about my experience, or let me tell you about this other experience. So like our Center for Dialogue, that is one way that those meaning structures get disrupted, right? Because you're attacking that instead of just like, let me give you this information, right? It's very easy to reject that information. And so there are lots of sort of techniques for that. Perspective, rhetoric is about perspective by incongruity and all of these things. Protest is a way that does that, right? It sort of brings those things to a head so that those structures start getting disrupted. That's when that change starts to happen. It is not easy. It is the hardest part because it's so easy to stay in those tracks and that belief system and that meaning structure. Very hard to jump off that track. Something has to really disrupt that movement. that's the kind of thing that communication does, that when you talk to those people, you say, look, you are doing that work, right? Because you are putting a face to this and you are saying, here's information, but here's how it's connected to things like white supremacy or racism or classism or the labor movement or whatever, right? So for me, that's the sort of thing that helps with these perception hacks too, right? This idea that language and rhetoric creates those perceptions. So how do we sort of then create a new perception, right? Something that goes in the place of that. I don't know if does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Well, specifics we can talk.
And I mean, I think also just in terms of like how we view the classroom as well, which is why there's so many different activities. It's not just exposure, at least for me when I'm teaching like race and politics. It's exposure to factual information, and it's also putting people in different scenarios. So for example, when I teach about the civil rights movement, when I teach about anything related to Jim Crow, I have my students do an actual literacy test. And I remember the first time I did this in one of my classes, like literally the first semester that I was here in the fall of 2014, I had these students take a literacy test from Louisiana, actually. From the state of Louisiana, I know, not good representation right now, but still, from the state of Louisiana, and I give them the same time, the exact questionnaire, and at the end of it, I'm like, would you be able to vote? You know, because if you miss one question, you can't vote. And the test is intentionally difficult, intentionally not made to pass. And it was in that moment that my students were like, oh, it's almost like I didn't want these people to vote because this test is impossible. And I was like, yes, you know, like that's correct, right? And so it is in a way like it's information, it's education, it's repeated exposure, but it's also making things, I think, really relevant to people in terms of like where they are currently located and where they might have the potential, you know, to go in terms of these beliefs. So another thing, just like when I'm teaching on like racism and segregation in my classes, I always show clips from Boston, you know, and what happened with integration in Boston during this entire movement. And people are like, I've lived in Boston my whole life. I've never seen these videos. I just thought this was a real Southern thing, right? That like racism is something that just lives down south and like not anywhere else, right? These are some beliefs that people have, right? And so like when you're in the classroom, like as a professor at least, you know, exposing people to different perspectives. As a student, this is the first time that a lot of people have been around so many different kinds of people in their lives. Most people are coming from really homogenous areas, whether that's racial and ethnic, whether that's religious. And so like 9 times out of 10, in my 10 years that I've been here, some people have never been exposed to these alternate perspectives. They might have seen them, but they've never had to engage with them. And so I think as a student, like there is an opportunity to engage, and I know that it can probably be really frustrating because you're like, I'm tired of having these conversations. But I just want you to know that I think the work that you or any other student that's involved in these conversations is helpful. I think that it will have an impact. You know, downstream, I've seen the impact that it's had in the 10 years since I've been here on campus. Just in terms of having these different alternatives where you can actually engage with people that are different from you. Is so valuable to changing people's perceptions, perspectives, because 9 times out of 10 they've never had that opportunity, and they likely won't have it again after they leave here because of things like residential segregation and other things. But we'll talk. We can talk, you know, afterwards.
All right, let's wrap up. Please join me in thanking our panel.